Imagine that. From the first second you hear these words, something begins to shift in your mind. Imagine that every image of romance, every idealized scene of pure and eternal love, begins to slowly crack, revealing fissures you never wanted to see. Now imagine that the person responsible for this rupture is not a sworn enemy of love, but a philosopher who believed that illusion is the worst prison a man can choose for himself. That man was Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer didn't soften his words to fit anyone's comfort zone. He didn't write to please, much less to save fragile dreams. He wrote to destroy what he considered a fatal lie. In his famous essay on women, he didn't offer praise. He offered a diagnosis. And this diagnosis to many sounded like cruelty, but to him, it was liberation. He described women not as society portrayed them, but as he believed nature had shaped them, guided by instincts of self-preservation, skilled in using emotion as a tool, and rarely bound by ideals of permanent loyalty. In his very first lines, Schopenhauer already dropped the mask. He asserted that only a man blinded by desire could call the female sex the fair sex. For him, this expression reflected a state of instinctive intoxication. Beauty, he said, was not a sign of nobility or lofty soul, but an instrument of nature, a lure designed to lead man into commitments that, under purely rational circumstances, he might never accept. Have you ever wondered how many crucial decisions in your life were born not from cold reasoning, but from the impact of a smile, a look, an implicit promise? This question is uncomfortable because it exposes something we often avoid acknowledging. Often, the impulse that leads us to enter into a deep relationship isn't love in the lofty sense we like to imagine, but a silent negotiation where one party plays with a rigged deck. Schopenhauer saw this with uncomfortable clarity. For him, while men fantasize about passion and legacy, women value stability and advantage, not out of malice, but because that's how nature programmed them. This is where the discomfort grows. We're not talking about exceptions or extreme cases. We're talking about a pattern repeated over centuries. A pattern he observed even before we had research on hypergamy, before we had evolutionary psychology or studies of social behavior. He saw that if the opportunity arose, a woman might change partners not because she had become evil or ungrateful, but because a new possibility offered more security, more status, or more resources. And the most disturbing thing is that, in his view, this wasn't a betrayal of love. It was fidelity to nature itself. This thought hits like a blow because it dismantles the romantic notion we so strenuously maintain. When someone says she loved you and then stopped loving you, we usually imagine a change of heart. But for Schopenhauer, there was no change. The feeling was temporary from the start, conditioned by circumstances. The bond was never absolute. It was a tacit contract, signed not with words but with biological and social signals. He didn't see tears as a pure expression of pain, nor gestures of affection as unwavering proof of affection. For him, each demonstration could also carry a strategic function, and this creates a terrible tension. How to differentiate true affection from instrumental affection. How to know if you are loved for who you are, or for what you represent in the moment. Schopenhauer believed that, more often than not, this distinction is not clear, and that humankind's fatal error is assuming it is. Here, an inevitable micro-conflict arises. Accepting this view means questioning memories, past relationships, and even the relationship you might have now. And it's precisely at this point that many prefer to reject his philosophy, calling it bitter, misogynistic, or outdated, because it's easier to protect the illusion than to face the possibility that the love we feel or receive may have a hidden expiration date. But if we set aside the initial shock, something curious happens. We begin to realize that this reading doesn't need to generate hatred, but rather caution. It's not a call to despise women, but to understand that there are invisible forces at work in every interaction, forces that can't be extinguished by promises or oaths. When a man understands this, he stops offering his loyalty as if it were an infinite currency. He begins to observe, to measure, to protect its value before giving it away. Schopenhauer insisted that man should not kneel before another's emotion without first asking, what does this emotion seek? What is its hidden purpose? This is not a cold vision, it is a lucid one. And perhaps it is precisely this lucidity that is so frightening, because it demands that we abandon the idea that love alone is sufficient to sustain a bond. For him, love is a vehicle, and the fate of this vehicle is rarely decided solely by the male passenger. What makes this reflection even more disturbing is realizing how it speaks to the present. We live in a time where options are just a click away. The instinct to seek the best opportunity, which might previously have been limited by circumstances and distance, now moves at the speed of the internet. And this means that what Schopenhauer described as a natural, slow, and gradual process can now happen in days, hours, or minutes. This acceleration doesn't create new instincts. It only intensifies old ones. That's why, if you look closely, you'll see that the emotional theater he described continues to play out, only with modern settings. Dating apps, social media, constant validation through likes and messages. The roles, however, are the same. He, the potential provider; she, the survival strategist; and the plot, always negotiated behind the scenes. You might be wondering, where does genuine love fit into this story? Schopenhauer didn't deny that it could exist, but he believed that even when it exists, it is never free from the influence of circumstances and interests. It's like a flame that, no matter how strong, still depends on the fuel that feeds it. When that fuel runs out, the flame isn't extinguished out of malice, just because it can no longer sustain itself. And here we come to a question that is perhaps the most uncomfortable of all. If we accept that this logic is real, how should we live? Should we distrust all affection? Should we become cold and isolated? Or is there a path where we can love without falling into emotional servitude? Schopenhauer pointed to this path, but offered no shortcuts. He wanted humankind to develop the capacity to see without blinding itself, to feel without surrendering completely, to offer without selling out. This first part of his thought isn't a final verdict, but an opening, an invitation for you to re-examine what you believe about love, loyalty, and human nature. Because if you continue to believe the stories you've heard are universal truths, you may discover too late that you weren't experiencing a romance, but playing a role in a plot that was already written long before you arrived. And this is where we leave the question that will echo until the next part. If all this emotional theater is not the exception, but the rule, how will you ensure that, in your story, you are the one writing the script? When Schopenhauer described women as part of a carefully orchestrated biological theater, he wasn't using exaggerated metaphors to provoke scandal. He truly believed that every gesture, every choice, and even every silence could carry a function that went beyond the surface. For him, feminine beauty was like a shop window, designed to attract attention, arouse desire, and lead to negotiations that, if viewed coldly, wouldn't be readily accepted. Charm wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Imagine a man walking into a party. He's surrounded by people, but his eyes are captured by a specific figure. It's not just the face, the dress, or the hair. It's the whole picture. The way she talks to someone, the way she laughs, the almost imperceptible movement of touching her neck when asking a question. This man may believe he's experiencing a spontaneous moment, but from Schopenhauer's perspective, nothing there is completely innocent. Nature has perfected these gestures over thousands of years to maximize a woman's ability to attract and choose. The most uncomfortable part is that, in his view, men rarely realize they're already in a negotiation process. While they believe they're winning, they're actually offering themselves. And women, even without conscious calculation, evaluate what this man represents: security, status, resources, emotional stability. She doesn't need to say any of this. She feels, compares, and decides. This reasoning seems cruel when applied to relationships we hold dear. After all, no one wants to think that a relationship began or ended based on an invisible calculation. But think of the number of stories you've heard or experienced where one party's interest seemed to wane as soon as a new opportunity arose. The new job in another city, the more influential coworker, the longtime friend who suddenly approaches. For Schopenhauer, this wasn't a sign of sudden moral corruption, but the fulfillment of a role imposed by biology itself. In everyday life, this translates into small signs that go unnoticed until the outcome is inevitable. A simple example, that relationship where her admiration for her partner begins to fade, not because he's changed drastically, but because he no longer demonstrates the same ambition she admired in the beginning. Perhaps he's opted for a quieter life, less focused on external achievements. In his eyes, this is maturity. In her eyes, it may be a warning that the future won't be as secure or stimulating as before. And so, without major fights or arguments, the distance grows. Schopenhauer saw beauty as an effective trap because he knew it didn't have to be permanent. In youth, he said, it's a high-return investment but a temporary one, an attraction designed to capture attention while instincts and interests take hold. This, he said, explains why so many relationships seem to radically transform over time. What was once a fascination becomes a habit, and what was once a priority becomes disposable. This point is particularly disturbing because it dismantles the traditional narrative of eternal love, based solely on sentiment. It suggests that love, in practice, can be conditioned by a kind of hidden time limit, sustained as long as the conditions that gave rise to it remain present. When these conditions change, whether through aging, loss of status, or the emergence of alternatives, the bond can weaken or even disappear. What makes this theory even more intriguing is how it stands the test of time. Even with cultural changes, equal rights, and new social dynamics, the core behavior Schopenhauer described can still be identified. The difference is that today, opportunities to apply this instinct are everywhere. Mobility, technology, and social media have made the range of choices virtually limitless. We can think, for example, about online interactions. A simple social media profile can expose a person to dozens of potential suitors every day. What once depended on sporadic physical encounters can now happen in seconds. And in this scenario, selection becomes more competitive, faster, and more calculated. The instinct Schopenhauer described doesn't disappear. It simply adapts to new tools. Bringing this to concrete examples, imagine a relationship in which the male partner believes he's in a stable and secure phase. Meanwhile, without him realizing it, his partner is being exposed to constant stimuli and comparisons. More successful coworkers, charismatic influencers, acquaintances who appear to offer a more attractive life. This bombardment of options can reactivate the instinctive mechanism of evaluating whether the current relationship is still the best choice. Often there's no conscious intention to cheat or break up, but the mind begins to weigh alternatives. Schopenhauer didn't say this to encourage paranoid distrust, but to remind people that they need to understand the game they're playing on. He believed that ignoring these dynamics was like entering a negotiation without knowing the rules, believing the other side was acting on pure emotion and no strategy. In the real world, he said, this doesn't happen. This reflection becomes even more relevant when we realize that, in many cases, it's not love that changes, but the perception of value. This means that the same man who seemed irresistible yesterday may become a less attractive choice tomorrow if he loses characteristics that once set him apart. And this change can occur without major events, simply through constant comparison with new options. This creates a silent suspense in any relationship, the uncertainty of whether what one has now will continue to be enough in the future. For some, this is a reason to intensify commitment and care. For others, it's a reason to maintain a strategic emotional distance, preventing the bond from turning into dependence. Schopenhauer tended to suggest that the second option offered more protection. But there's one detail that makes everything even more complex. It's not always easy to identify when this evaluation is taking place. It often manifests itself in subtle changes in behavior, less enthusiasm, less physical contact, less willingness to invest time and energy. By the time a partner notices, it may be too late to reverse the decision already formed in their mind. These observations raise uncomfortable questions. To what extent is the love we receive conditioned by circumstances? How can we balance surrender and self-preservation without falling into absolute cynicism? Is there a balance point where it is possible to live intensely without exposing ourselves completely to the vulnerability Schopenhauer warns of? The answer, in his philosophy, is not to avoid love, but to enter into it with full awareness of the risks and dynamics at play. This means accepting that, in many cases, the bond is not purely emotional, but also strategic, and that recognizing this doesn't destroy love, it just makes it more realistic. By observing the relationship histories that surround us, those of friends, family, and public figures, we can identify traces of this pattern. The challenge is deciding what to do with this information. Ignoring it can keep the illusion alive longer, but it also increases the likelihood of falling apart when it shatters. Facing it requires courage, but it can offer a kind of freedom few people experience, the freedom to love without illusions. And it is precisely this freedom that paves the way for the next step, where the game ceases to be just about attraction and begins to involve invisible weapons that shape behaviors, decisions, and even identities. Because, as Schopenhauer suggested, the real battle is rarely in what we see, but in what we feel without realizing it was induced. When Schopenhauer asserted that women win not through logic but through emotion, he wasn't just expressing an isolated opinion. He was describing a silent power structure, rooted in centuries of adaptation. For him, the most dangerous battle is not fought with arguments, but with gestures, silences, and small manipulations that, when accumulated, shape the other's behavior without them even realizing it. This, in his view, is what makes emotional power so effective. It is nearly invisible to those under its influence. The power of this idea lies in the fact that it recurs in common situations. Think of the moment someone avoids direct conflict, but plants an emotionally charged comment that will resonate in the other person's mind for hours or days. There's no frontal attack, just a seed planted with precision. Later, that seed develops into doubt, guilt, or a need for compensation. Schopenhauer believed that this kind of strategy, used instinctively, was a central part of the female arsenal. But why is this kind of influence so difficult to combat? Perhaps because, unlike a logical attack, which can be countered with data or arguments, an emotional attack infiltrates the most vulnerable space, your own identity. When someone messes with your perception of yourself, rational responses become unstable. Have you ever noticed how much easier it is to counter an objective accusation than to deal with the feeling of disappointing someone you love? This is the first pattern breaker, realizing that not all manipulation is conscious. Often, it arises as a result of emotional reflexes shaped over generations. Schopenhauer observed that in ancient times, when physical strength was the primary currency, women needed to develop alternative skills to survive and gain ground. The ability to generate guilt, inspire protection, or induce behavior through vulnerability became as vital as brute force was for men. In everyday life, this can manifest itself in subtle ways. The disappointed look that silences an action, the prolonged silence that makes someone rethink their position, the calculated compliment that conditions future behavior. These actions are rarely perceived as tactics, but they produce precise results. Have you ever wondered how many of your most personal decisions were actually emotional reactions to indirect cues? Bringing this perspective to the present, it's impossible to ignore how much technology has enhanced these mechanisms. A simple lack of response on a messaging app, for example, can generate anxiety and even behavioral changes. An ambiguous comment in public can transform someone's social perception of themselves. The battlefield that was once limited to the physical space now extends to the digital realm, where interactions are constant and often public. And here lies the second pattern break. Emotional power doesn't have to be used to destroy, but the risk is always present. It can unite or divide, strengthen or weaken. However, man's vulnerability to this weapon lies in the fact that he is trained, from an early age, to value it without question. He is taught to be sensitive, considerate, and willing to yield. Little is said about the limits of this surrender, and it is almost never warned that emotion, like any tool, can be used for control. This gap in guidance creates a scenario where many men confuse submission with care and patience with passivity. Schopenhauer saw this as a serious risk. By becoming accustomed to responding positively to any emotional signal, men become too malleable. They begin to shape their behavior not by what they believe is right, but by what avoids immediate discomfort. And this silent shift, repeated over time, ends up transforming their identity. Have you ever considered how many of your habits may have arisen this way? Small concessions that initially seemed like loving gestures, but which, when added together, change the way you act, speak, and even think. This realization, though uncomfortable, is a fundamental step toward regaining balance. Because in Schopenhauer's logic, true freedom begins when you recognize that you don't need to react automatically to every emotional stimulus you receive. And here we enter the third pattern break. Understanding that resisting emotional power doesn't mean becoming insensitive. It means creating space to evaluate before acting. It means asking yourself if the reaction you're about to have is truly your own, or if it's the result of a subtle pressure you haven't noticed. This mental space is what separates the free person from the person shaped by invisible forces. Putting this into practice requires vigilance and, above all, self-awareness. It's important to identify emotional triggers, recognize when a reaction is disproportionate, and understand where it comes from. Often this origin isn't in the present, but in past experiences, old situations where giving in was easier than facing the discomfort. The problem is that when this pattern repeats itself, it becomes the norm. The suspense surrounding this reflection is clear. If this kind of influence is so subtle, how can we detect when it's occurring? Schopenhauer's answer wasn't simple. He suggested that humans learn to observe patterns, not isolated episodes. An occasional emotional reaction can be authentic, but when certain responses emerge whenever a specific objective is at stake, it's a sign that something else is at work. And perhaps the most disturbing point of all is this: many of these dynamics don't dissolve over time. They become refined. What begins as a simple gesture becomes years later a nearly automatic control mechanism. And the more a person becomes accustomed to responding, the harder it is to break the cycle. This awareness is what leads to the next stage of reflection, where the focus shifts from simply recognizing emotional power to learning how not to become its hostage. Because in the end, as Schopenhauer warned, the greatest prison isn't the one someone else builds for you. It's the one you maintain yourself, believing you're being loving when, in fact, you're just giving in. Schopenhauer believed that the danger lay not only in recognizing emotional power, but in the silent habit it creates over time. When a man becomes accustomed to shaping his life around female validation, what once seemed like a gesture of affection turns into dependence. And this dependence, even disguised as love, slowly erodes his autonomy, establishing itself as an invisible addiction. He saw this dynamic as a gradual, almost imperceptible training. At first, a man gives up small things to avoid conflict or to please others. He changes schedules, adjusts plans, adapts his opinions, and makes seemingly innocent concessions. But when accumulated, these concessions form a new identity, a version of himself shaped not by what he believes, but by what he fears losing. What begins as a partnership becomes emotional conditioning, and this conditioning silently undermines his essence. Studies in relational psychology confirm that emotional dependence can even alter chemical patterns in the brain. The release of dopamine and oxytocin, associated with moments of affection, creates a cycle of reward and pursuit, similar to that of an addiction. When affection is withdrawn, the impact is not only psychological, but also physical. Withdrawal symptoms arise: anxiety, impulsive decision-making, regret, and loss of self-esteem. The person finds themselves hostage to the other person's approval. Imagine a man who spends years believing that maintaining harmony means never disagreeing. He avoids confrontation, swallows frustrations, and pretends to agree with choices that don't reflect his desires. Little by little, his own voice disappears. When the relationship ends, he doesn't just lose his partner, he loses his sense of who he is. This is the trap Schopenhauer described, the man who sacrifices his essence believing it to be proof of love. This isn't uncommon. Research from institutions like the National Institute of Mental Health shows that the rate of post-breakup depression is significantly higher in men who were in relationships where the role of emotional provider was central. They not only feel rejected, but experience a rupture in their identity. It's as if, by being dumped, they've been dismissed from the only role they knew how to play. Culture reinforces this behavior. From an early age, many men learn that doing everything for her is the measure of masculine worth. Films, songs, and narratives reinforce the idea that unconditional sacrifice will be rewarded with eternal love. But Schopenhauer, long before pop culture, warned that this belief is an invitation to disaster, because it ignores a fundamental point. Love, to be sustainable, must be sustained by respect, not submission. Current data shows how costly this illusion is. Research on divorces in the United States indicates that approximately 70% of separations are initiated by women. Among the most cited reasons are not only infidelity or violence, but also lack of emotional satisfaction and loss of admiration for the partner. This reveals that even when a man believes he is giving everything, this surrender can undermine the very thing that keeps attraction alive. Trying to please without limits can have the opposite effect. By relinquishing leadership, opinion, and personal purpose, a person loses the magnetism that initially sparked interest. It's like a leader who gives up all decisions to avoid displeasing, and therefore, they cease to be seen as a leader. And when admiration fades, the bond weakens. Studies of couple behavior show that relationships in which the man maintains his individuality, even in the face of conflict, tend to be more stable and satisfying in the long run. It's not about rigidity or coldness, but about firmness in principles. Schopenhauer would argue that this firmness is the basis of male sovereignty. But how can you maintain this posture in an emotional environment that pressures you to give in? Consider the story of a man who, over the years, said yes to everything his partner asked. One day, she decides to leave, saying she misses someone who takes control of their own life. For him, it's a brutal contradiction. He did exactly what he thought was right, and yet he lost. This shock can be devastating, but also liberating. Many, after the initial pain, report a rebirth. They realize they lived to keep the other person satisfied, and that this quest was endless. Schopenhauer would see this as proof that control through submission is a trap. You never guarantee affection by giving everything away. You only guarantee that when it's gone, you'll have less of yourself to rebuild. The dilemma is clear. Live to avoid immediate discomfort, or accept the tension necessary to preserve your identity. This tension is what separates the person who loses himself from the one who remains. It's like sailing in a rough sea. Following every wave is losing your way. Keeping the helm steady ensures that, despite the storms, your destiny will be yours. This is the essence of Schopenhauer's warning. It's not coldness or selfishness. It's inner leadership. It's the kind of leadership that allows you to love deeply without dissolving into the other. Ultimately, the proof of love isn't in giving up on yourself, but in sharing yourself without losing yourself. This rare balance defines those who emotionally survive the inevitable changes of any relationship. Schopenhauer didn't see detachment as coldness, but as the mind's greatest form of protection. For him, a man's true strength lay not in his ability to win affection, but in his ability to avoid becoming a slave to it. What he proposed was more than sentimental advice. It was a philosophy of emotional survival. He understood that, in a world driven by impulses and interests, those who cling unfiltered relinquish control over themselves. Detachment, from this perspective, is not the absence of feeling, but the constant presence of self-control and clarity. When we talk about detachment, many immediately think of indifference, a state where nothing matters. But what Schopenhauer advocated was different, a position in which humankind maintains clarity and autonomy even when feeling intensely. It's the ability to love without losing oneself, to engage without submitting, and this requires training and daily awareness, because the human instinct is to seek security in others, especially when that security is clothed in affection, attention, and promises. This practice begins with the awareness that every relationship is, in some way, a field of exchange, and in this exchange, interests are not always aligned or remain stable over time. Schopenhauer believed that much of male suffering stems from the error of interpreting temporary signs as eternal promises. A man sees a gesture of care and imagines it will last forever, but if the context changes, the gesture can disappear without warning. Detachment, then, is accepting that nothing is guaranteed and that the value of a bond cannot be above its own integrity. To apply this, emotional discipline is required. Imagine a man who begins to notice small signs of manipulation, disrespect, or loss of reciprocity in his relationship. Instead of reacting desperately or trying to regain attention at any cost, he observes, analyzes, and calmly decides what to do. This stance isn't passivity, it's strategy. He understands that giving in to the urge to constantly prove himself is giving up the power he has over himself. Herein lies the essence of Schopenhauer's thought. No matter how strong the emotion, it should never have complete control over your actions. This view is echoed in Stoicism, a philosophy that also advocates mastery over one's own reactions. The Stoic knows he cannot control the behavior of others, but he can control how he responds to it. For Schopenhauer, the person who adopts this stance becomes immune to many emotional traps. He does not stop feeling, but he does not allow his feelings to blind him. He can look at the situation and separate emotion from reality, avoiding acting solely driven by the need to please or be accepted. There's a clear example of this in the modern world: the unexpected end of a relationship. Most men react by trying to salvage the bond, expending energy, trying to win back someone who's already decided to leave. Schopenhauer would say this is a losing battle because it's based on a flawed premise, that the other person's decision can be reversed only by unilateral effort. The detached man, on the other hand, accepts the end with dignity. He doesn't beg. He doesn't trade his own dignity in exchange for attention. He walks away, preserving his worth and his peace. This attitude may seem cold to those accustomed to measuring love by desperate displays. But in practice, it preserves something more valuable: self-esteem. And self-esteem for Schopenhauer was one of the pillars of individual freedom. A person who doesn't see himself as sufficient on his own tends to seek constant validation, and this makes him vulnerable to emotional games. On the other hand, someone who knows and respects himself can enter and leave any relationship without losing his essence. He doesn't fear loneliness because he fills it with purpose. The most profound point of this philosophy is that detachment is not a shield to avoid pain. Pain is inevitable. It is a filter to prevent pain from turning into internal destruction. When you cling blindly, any loss feels like the end of the world. When you practice detachment, loss hurts, but it doesn't break you. You grieve, process, and move on, because your foundation wasn't in the other, it was in you. This approach also changes the way men choose their relationships. Instead of getting involved to fill a void, they get involved to add something to a life that is already complete in itself. They don't enter into relationships out of necessity, but by conscious choice. This drastically reduces tolerance for toxic behaviors, because they know they don't need to submit to them to continue living well. Schopenhauer would say that the person who masters detachment becomes sovereign. They don't need to prove anything to keep someone close. Their presence becomes more valuable precisely because it's not forced. They aren't available at any cost, and this creates a natural respect. At the same time, they don't use detachment as a weapon to manipulate, but as a defense against being manipulated. In today's world, where relationships can begin and end with the speed of a click, this skill is more necessary than ever. The abundance of options and ease of replacement cause fragile bonds to break for trivial reasons. Without detachment, each rupture becomes an emotional earthquake. With detachment, people maintain control of their own territory and rebuild what they need without losing themselves in the process. The greatest benefit of this practice is not avoiding suffering, but building a life that doesn't depend exclusively on someone's affection for meaning. This doesn't mean living isolated or without love, but understanding that love is a complement, not the center of one's existence. When this vision is internalized, one can love more freely because one doesn't fear losing oneself in the process. This is the true shield Schopenhauer proposed. Not a wall that prevents any connection, but a fortress with selective gates. You choose who enters, and if necessary, you know how to close the gates without destroying the structure. In the end, this ability doesn't drive away true love, it attracts it. Because only those who are whole can offer something true, and only those who don't fear loss are able to fully experience what they gain. If you've made it this far, it's because something within you has already begun to shift. It may not be something that can be measured or explained right now, but it's a feeling that's there, as if a curtain has been pulled back and, for the first time, you see what's always been right in front of you. It's at this point that Schopenhauer's philosophy ceases to be just theory and becomes an intimate call to action. Understanding that human nature is driven by self-interest, that emotion can be used as a weapon, and that blind attachment is a risk isn't enough. Knowing this and not acting is like seeing a storm approaching and standing still, hoping it won't hit you. You need a plan, and this plan isn't limited to relationships but extends to how you live, make decisions, and forge your own path. The first step is conscious observation. Dedicate at least 7 days to paying attention to your reactions, especially in situations that trigger intense emotions. Ask yourself, is this reaction genuinely mine, or is it conditioned by the fear of losing someone? By doing this, you'll begin to realize how many of your attitudes are automatic responses to external, often manipulative stimuli. This awareness is the foundation of all change. The second step is to establish clear and firm boundaries. It's not about creating barriers that isolate you, but about erecting defenses that preserve your value. When someone repeatedly crosses these boundaries, it's no longer a matter of communication, it's a lack of respect. And respect is the foundation of any healthy relationship. Clear boundaries act as filters. They protect you from trading your essence in exchange for temporary approval. The third step is to develop emotional and practical independence. This means filling your life with activities, goals, and pleasures that don't depend on someone else's mood or presence. Cultivate hobbies, acquire new skills, and advance personal projects. When your identity is nurtured by yourself, the chance of losing yourself in someone else dramatically decreases. The fourth step is learning to withdraw with dignity. Not every battle needs to be fought, nor every relationship needs to be maintained. Knowing how to leave before internal destruction begins is a sign of maturity and strength. This isn't giving up, it's prioritizing your integrity. The fifth step is to cultivate continuous self-analysis. Set aside a weekly moment to reflect. Am I acting according to my principles, or am I molding myself to please others? This simple question can save years of your life that would otherwise be spent in emotional submission disguised as love. The sixth step is to practice strategic silence. Not every provocation deserves a response, and not everything needs to be countered immediately. Silence is one of the most powerful weapons of emotional control. It creates space for you to think, observe, and decide clearly. And, as Schopenhauer reminded us, clarity is the highest form of power. Apply these steps consistently, and you'll begin to feel real changes. Not just in your relationships, but in how you see and value yourself. You'll discover that you don't need to beg for space, attention, or respect. And paradoxically, when you don't need it, that's when you attract it the most. But be prepared. There will be days when old patterns will try to creep back in. You'll feel like giving in, explaining yourself, giving up what you believe in to avoid conflict. It's in these moments that you need to remember why you started. Every time you stand firm, you build something much bigger than a relationship. You build your sovereignty. When you reach this state, you realize you can love more purely, without fear, without anxiety, without the constant need to prove something. You love because you want to, not because you have to. You stay because it's a choice, not an obligation. And that changes absolutely everything. Now, the choice is yours. You can watch this video and let it become a part of your routine, or you can make it a turning point. Start today. Pick one step and implement it immediately. Then move on to the next. Adjust, repeat, improve. Feel the progress week after week. If this message resonated with you and opened a new space of clarity in your mind, I want to ask two things. First, subscribe to the Deep Psyche channel to continue this journey. Here, each video is created to deepen your perception and strengthen your mind. Second, like this video and leave a comment below, sharing any questions or personal experiences, anonymously if you prefer. Your story may be exactly what someone else needs to hear to change. Remember, you are not alone in this process. And with every step you take, keep alive the purpose of opening yourself to the world so consciously that no one will ever have the power to close you off again.